I'm Jeff Fritz with SoundStage.com, and I'm joined today by Jonathan Gorse. He is a senior contributor for SoundStage, and we are welcoming him aboard with this video. And Jonathan, how are you today?
Well, I'm good, Jeff. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to come speak to you today.
Well, I appreciate it. And, I was thinking about it before the interview. If this were a sports team, if SoundStage were a sports team, you would be what's termed an impact player, because you kind of hit SoundStage right away with some terrific content. And I just want to tell people where to find your writing. So there's two places. The first one, and this is primarily where you'll be contributing, is soundstageultra.com. And you've got two terrific articles already there, one on Michelle Engineering, and the other, which is a review of some fantastic ATC loudspeakers. So just so everyone's aware, there's some content there from Jonathan. And as well, you just recently wrote a piece on the SME Model 60 flagship turntable launch, and that is on soundstageglobal.com. And so folks can also tune in there to find that content from you as well. So Jonathan, just to get started here, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in hi-fi and in hi-fi writing.
Yeah, well, in fact, my interest in music started really, I guess, around the age of 11 or 12, because growing up as a kid, my parents had one of those huge teak cabinet kind of radiogram things, a valve-powered, pretty poor quality sound. And I think actually one day my mother was electrocuted by the thing. So my father decided, he better do something about this, having a young child in the house who was liable to get killed by it. So he went out and, with the advice of a friend of his who was a local radio DJ, actually, ended up buying a Technics rack system. And this would have been around 1982, I guess. So I was about 13. And immediately I was struck by the enormous change in sound. It was just so much more transparent, would go so much louder, was so much clearer. And it may not be high-end hi-fi, but compared to a 1950s, teak cabinet radiogram, it was night and day better. And so I got really fascinated by the subject, really, of how components influence sound. And obviously that was around the time as well that I was getting into music as a young teenager. So I'd started buying records, and I spent hours and hours then listening on this particular rack system. And then eventually, around the age of 16, I didn't want to sit anymore in the lounge, with my parents listening to music. I kind of wanted to get music up into my bedroom. So I then saved up some money, and I had about £100 or so together. And it was enough that it would have bought me a kind of one-piece music center, those kind of integrated things that people had in the 70s with a tuner and a turntable and a set of speakers. But I knew that was going to mean that the sound quality was going to be way below what I was used to listening to on my father's system. So I decided to get a set of British bookshelf speakers, a set of Morden Short speakers, and put them in my bedroom, and then run huge lengths of cable down to my father's system downstairs. So now the downside, it sounded great, and I was really chuffed with the sound I was getting up there. In fact, they were better than the speakers he had downstairs. But the downside of it was that I was then missing the first 20 seconds of every album, because I would, drop the needle on the turntable, have to run up the stairs then back to my bedroom from the lounge. And kind of by the time I started, I was 20 seconds into Dark Side of the Moon or whatever. So that was kind of the beginning of that. And then when I was going away to university, I had to then get my own system together. So then I I got very friendly with a local hi-fi store. And I think they took pity on me, because I clearly had no money, and they stocked a whole load of really quite high-end Lin and Naim and all this kind of gear that I couldn't possibly afford as a student. And so I got myself a turntable, first of all, secondhand, a turntable by a Scottish firm called System Deck. It was a System Deck 2X. I don't know whether you ever got those across in the States, but it was a sort of Rager equivalent, I guess. And then I auditioned. I went along to my hi-fi dealer to audition an Arkham Alpha amplifier, which at the time was kind of the budget amp to buy. And anyway, I was listening to that and I was about to buy it. And the guys in the shop said, look, just wait there 1 second. We're just going to plug something else in and see what you think of it. So they went and got the kind of lowest of the low Naim amp, which at the time was the Naim Nate, the integrated, plugged it in. And we played, it was The Wall, actually, by Pink Floyd, a side of The Wall. And I was just astonished at the difference between the Arcam and the Naim. The Naim brought the music to life. It was much quicker and more dynamic sounding, a lot more powerful sounding, even though it wasn't a particularly high output amp. And so that formed the basis then of my first system. And I took that away to university with me, and made a lot of noise in the dorm halls and disturbed people and stuff listening to music till all hours. But, and then obviously once I was working, then I kind of gradually upgraded the system. Now, I was pretty keen at this point. I was reading all the hi-fi mags. I was, heavily into music, spending all my available money on records and that. I didn't get into CD until a bit later because I couldn't afford to buy a player. So I just carried on buying vinyl, really. And eventually I saw in Hi-Fi News, they actually advertised for a contributor. And so this would have been in the late 90s. So they just said, send a review in of your system. So by that time, I was running a Michel Gyrodec and a Naim pre-power combo with Naim speakers. And so I wrote a review of my system and sent it in and forgot all about it, actually. And then about 6 weeks later, got a call from the editor of Hi-Fi News, Steve Harris, just saying, wow, we got your article and you can really write. Would you like to write for the magazine? So that then started a sideline for me where I was contributing to Hi-Fi News and reviewing gear each month. And in fact, that then led to me discovering the speakers that I use now. So way back around the year 2000, I'd never really settled in with the Naim speakers. I love their amps, I love their CD players, but I found the speakers, I had a set of speakers called Naim SBLs, and I found them just lacking in bottom end. They were very clear and crisp and fast, but a bit lacking in warmth, really. And I took in a pair of ATC stand mount speakers for review and was just completely blown away. It was a night and day difference over what I'd been listening to before. And unfortunately, I couldn't actually afford to buy them. So that led to a 20-year love affair with ATC speakers, which I only recently, well, I say recently, a couple of years back, managed to finally buy a pair. So I'm now running SCM 40 ATC speakers in my main system, and the Naims are now doing rear channel duty for home cinema. So yeah, that's kind of where I got to now, and how I got involved in reviewing, I guess.
Well, it's really interesting. Some of the brands that you talked about, Mordaunt Short, Arcam, Naim, up through the ATC speakers that you own now. That really leads me to my next question. You've obviously sampled quite a bit of UK made, UK designed and made gear through the years. And, just to kind of let everybody know, we were exchanging emails recently, and the subject came up of the UK hi-fi scene versus the North American hi-fi scene and some of the differences. And that's really my next question is I wanted just to hear your observations about what are the differences just in what we value in terms of sound presentation from your perspective in North America versus the UK? What are your thoughts on that?
I do think there's a difference, actually, and I do think that there's a very strong thread of kind of the British sound running through a lot of British products, and I think it's a function, actually, of a couple of different things. It's partly because of the BBC, actually, because I think the BBC's had a huge impact on the sound of British hi-fi generally, because they've always sought to deliver sound that's very neutral. And they developed and sponsored the development of things like the LS35, the small bookshelf monitor speaker, because they wanted a really neutral sounding speaker for mixing in outside broadcast situations. And they also developed a larger monitor then for studio use. And they licensed the production of that monitor out to various UK companies like Rogers and Spendor and Goodman's. And And I think that certainly is one element, that neutrality is one element of the British hi-fi sound. And I think to a degree, it's probably influenced a lot of other companies that weren't even associated with those BBC designs. And the other thing that I think affects the sound that we strive for in England is that our homes are smaller than yours. You know, I mean, we live in a country that's a lot more constrained on land, partly because, you know, I was reading the other day that 50% of the land in the UK is owned by 1% of the population. You know, we've got the aristocracy who own enormous amounts of land. So the rest of us are all sort of packed like battery hens into these quite small houses with quite small rooms. And therefore, you can't put a huge set of Wilsons in a small room. And I think, well, you can, but you're probably going to overdrive the room if you try it. And so I think, you know, whereas the American sound, I think, is geared more to having very large speakers pulled well out from the walls. You know, I mean, I'm thinking about things like Martin Logan electrostatics, for instance, that, you know, you've got to have those well out of away from the perimeter of the room. And, you know, things like the larger speakers that the Americans are famed for. So I think the British became associated with these kind of smaller bookshelf monitor type speakers and amplifiers that were sort of taut and neutral and fast. And so companies like Naim, for instance, you know, they're famed for their whole pace, rhythm and timing thing. And I think those small bookshelf monitors ultimately can't offer full bandwidth. And they also probably can't offer a lot of depth in terms of sound staging, because once you start using the boundaries of a room for bass reinforcement by putting the speakers right up against the back of the wall, you then lose so much of the stage depth that you were striving to capture. So in some ways, the British sound is a compromise, I think, based around the size of our domestic living arrangements, and also based around the ideology, if you like, of BBC engineering. And you know, there's a really strong engineering background, I guess, in the British audio industry. You know, you go right the way back to, you know, the 1890s when, you know, people were experimenting. Marconi was experimenting with the first radio transmission. And then you had the building of Abbey Road in 1931, I think, when that was the world's first commercial recording studio. And then, you know, you had Blumlein inventing stereo recording in the early 30s. So there's a deep well, if you like, of engineering expertise in British audio. And I think that's continued on through, you know, Neve inventing modern mixing consoles in the early 60s. And so the British have had a really strong technical lead, I think, in a lot of areas to do with sound recording and sound propagation and radio. And then you had a whole load of people who were being sort of demobilized after the war, who were coming out of the military with a lot of military, you know, engineering, electronic engineering expertise, having worked in radio and radar and on valve electronics. And so those people were then coming into the hi-fi industry, if you like, and taking their expertise and setting up companies or joining companies like Rogers or Quad. And so I think the whole British hi-fi industry has almost benefited from a quite unique set of circumstances. You know, small houses, the BBC, the availability of a lot of skilled labour after the war, and that whole Lynn Naim thing about pace, rhythm, and timing that really caught the imagination, I think, in the late 70s and early 80s, because so much hi-fi was sold in the past, you know, based on how it measured or based on kind of nebulous concepts that, you know, a frequency response, or was there enough treble, or was there enough bass? Whereas I think what Lynn and Naim quite cleverly came forward and did was they said, look, it's not about that. It's about, can you follow the bass guitar line? Do the drums sound like live drums? Does the snare have the attack that a snare has? When you stand next to a live drummer, you know, and you hear the impact of a live drum kit, it's about capturing that and capturing that emotional impact. And so I think, yeah, I don't know whether you agree with that, Jeff, but that's kind of my perception.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. And I think, although I would add one other aspect, I think, you know, when you were talking about the size of the homes in the UK versus in North America, I think that one of the reasons that the two-way bookshelf was so popular obviously for the reasons that you gave, but it's also just a function of building speakers that fit the room properly and would load the room properly, right? With the placement constraints that you may face in a smaller room, having to put the speakers closer to the wall, knowing that you're going to get some boundary reinforcement. You're building a speaker that's actually going to work in the room that it's likely to be placed in, and so just from an acoustic standpoint, the engineers made the right call. Now, in the U.S. Specifically, where you have generally much larger rooms, not only, and this is something that has been a trend for quite some time, not only are larger floor standing speakers more the norm, and yes, of course, you're right, those speakers are generally pulled out into the room a little bit more, but what we're seeing more and more of are larger floor standing speakers, then even supplemented by large subwoofers. And so, and there's certainly reasons for that acoustically. One of the things you mentioned, sound staging and imaging, is a big priority for listeners in North America. You pull the speakers out into the room a little bit more. You enhance the precision of imaging within the soundstage, but it may not be great for bass optimization, right? So then you add a subwoofer, and now, or maybe two subwoofers, and now you're able to smooth the bass response, get full range sound, optimize imaging, and you're able to accomplish all that because the rooms are larger. You've got more real estate to work with. So, that's the type of a system model that perhaps just would not work. It would not be feasible in an average UK room. And so I would imagine if we were to look at subwoofer sales, for instance, I would imagine it's probably much greater in North America than in the UK. What would be your reaction to that?
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I think particularly if you're talking about augmenting two-channel audio sound with a subwoofer, which is quite rare in the UK, whereas I think in America that's probably a lot more common. There are people in the UK who set up their home cinemas and they buy a subwoofer because they want to get the deep bass, the 0.1 channel, if you like, off their DVD or Blu-ray player. But I think the numbers of people that are actually combining a subwoofer with a set of two-channel speakers is really, really low. And I guess there are some people who are doing it because they've only got a small bookshelf monitor and they want to, extend the bass response down further. But I'd agree with you, Jeff, actually, that I think it's less common to use subwoofers in the UK.
Now, I did have one other question for you, because certainly the integrated amplifier, is something that, and you mentioned when you were setting up your initial systems way back when, with the Naim integrated, and potentially the RCAM before you were sold on the Naim. And separates are super, super common now. You could easily say maybe the past 10 years, the super integrated amplifier has really gained a lot of traction in the US, but I'm not sure that that's a function of limited real estate as much as some other factors. But certainly the gold standard, at least in North America, is a separates-based system, either a stereo amplifier, monoblock amplifiers. Do you see the integrated amplifier just far outpacing separates in the UK in terms of sales and just building systems around that type of component?
I think the integrated amplifier will probably always outsell the preamp power combo actually in the UK, largely because I suspect that hi-fi in a way is almost like a pyramid. So at the bottom, you've got a whole bunch of people who buy lower end hi-fi, which usually means an integrated amplifier, some kind of basic streamer or turntable or CD player, and a set of modest but good speakers. And then as you go up in price, I think there are less and less people prepared to climb the mountain, if you like, to get right to the top. So, moving up to a preamp power amp is an expensive thing to do. So I suspect there are quite a lot of people that probably do stop at the integrated and never go beyond it. But there's no question that there's still a sizable high-end market. Companies like Naim have made a living out of selling multiple power supplies to people for every single element of the system. I mean, they got people who are putting a super cat power supply on their phono stages. It's kind of almost gets out of hand. But
that is an interesting point that you make, and I hadn't really thought about that. But Naim with the number of boxes that you can outfit a Naim system with, that's not necessarily a real estate saving system model there. So, no. what would be the difference? And this is just a curiosity question because I'm not super familiar with Naim equipment. What would be the thinking between, a multiple box Naim system with separate power supplies versus a preamplifier and a stereo amplifier, which you may end up with less boxes with the separates than with the integrated system over here with the separate power supplies?
Yeah. Well, I think Naim's whole philosophy actually is heavily based upon, stable power feeds to their boxes. So as you say, one of the ways you upgrade a Naim system isn't necessarily to add a better power amp or a better preamp, it's to add a better power supply. Okay. And that's deeply embedded in their whole philosophy, actually. And I think they've probably made such a success of it because they've almost, in a way, the complexity of their range simplifies what you need to do as an end consumer. So in the Naim hierarchy, if you like, there's always the next step, and it's always quite clearly mapped, and it's always, readily demonstrable that there's an improvement if you add this extra box. Now, getting your wife or whoever to accept the extra box in the living room is another matter, but but yeah, I think you're right, actually. I mean, the downside of that approach is that you are adding multiple boxes potentially where, you could go and buy a Mark Levinson amplifier or something and you'd get a preamp, you get a power amp, and that would be it, which is potentially a neater solution. But I think Naim has its adherence because it's a fairly unique sounding product. I think there are only a couple of other manufacturers that sort of major on the drama of live performance to the degree that Naim does. It's not, in some ways, I would say it's not an easy listen. If you want to put music on and sit back with a drink and kind of, listen to mellow folk music, it may not be the kind of amplifier that you're actually looking for, because it's very in your face and very direct and kind of explosive in a way. And that works quite well, I guess, with rock music, and it works quite well when you're in the mood for it. But it's got the potential to be a little bit too much at the end of a hard day when you're sitting down pouring a glass of wine and just wanting to chill out. So I've got a couple of friends actually who don't use Naim amps and don't like them because of that, because they feel that they're always demanding too much attention in the way that a live performer demands attention, but that's exactly why I love them, and lots of other people do as well, because they're very immediate sounding and kind of live sounding.
Well, and you touched on another interesting point there, and that is that with the Naim equipment and the power supplies, you're not necessarily having to sell a box to buy a new box. You're upgrading the system that you have and you're enhancing it. And so that's, that kind of avoids the hassle of trading in a piece of equipment or selling a piece of equipment. And there's certainly a beauty and a convenience in that approach as well.
Yeah, and actually Naim anyway, because it's very dependable and because they can still repair all the amps they've ever made, I think, the resale values tend to hold up quite well anyway, and the dealers are always looking for trade-in Naim equipment. So trading up through the range is relatively painless, so far as trading in and trading up. And like I say, in a way, that sort of building block approach to the system makes life easier in terms of choices, I suppose, if you plan on staying within the Naim environment. As soon as you step outside, you face a world of complexity,
right?
Which I guess people like us are there to try and advise on. But
well, speaking of that, so that brings me to my last question, Jonathan. We've talked about the North American hi-fi scene, the UK hi-fi scene. Soon in just a matter of a few weeks. In fact, you'll be in Munich with the SoundStage crew, and we will be covering High End 2022 in Munich, Germany, and the whole world will be there. In fact, as far as the hi-fi world is concerned. What are you looking forward to seeing in Munich? And tell us, have you ever been to High End? I'm not sure that you have. And if you haven't, what have you heard about it? And what are you looking forward to?
Well, I've heard it's enormous, and I'm really, really looking forward to just getting out there and seeing, I think, a lot more of the international products, really. So, I'm expecting to see a lot of stuff. I've attended a lot of the shows, obviously, in the UK. Bristol is one of the main ones, and the Ascot show, which is organised by Hi-Fi News magazine. And, both of those attract a fair spread of international audio companies. But there's no doubt that Munich is specifically targeted at the high end and attracts basically the world's best from everywhere. So the stuff I'm looking forward to hearing at Munich is actually the stuff that I have very little knowledge of, or that I've haven't come across before. So what I'm most looking forward to actually is discovering fantastic new products and fantastic new manufacturers that I'm less familiar with. In addition to that, I'm obviously looking forward to going and visiting the rooms for the companies whose products I really love. So, I'll look forward very much to seeing what SME are doing there, for instance. And I'm keen to see if they're going to take a Model 60 turntable over and hear that being demonstrated. I'm also pretty keen to explore things like the Wilson speakers, because I have been at a few Wilson demos in the UK. But they're not a brand that I have experienced a huge amount of. And so I'll be quite interested to see how they compare to my love of ATC speakers, which I sort of see as the Rolls Royce of British speakers, if you like. I've just got a pair of their larger SCM 50s in at the moment for review for SoundStage. And I'm blown away by how fabulous they are. But it'll be really interesting to see how the American brands stack up against those and the larger ATC monitors. I'm also quite keen, I guess, to explore some of the lifestyle products that might be there. So, Cambridge Audio making some really nice stuff now that you'd want to put in a bedroom or a study or something. I'm quite keen to see what they've managed to engineer in a sort of lifestyle product. But yeah, I guess I'm just keen to embrace it all, really, and see as much of it as I possibly can, and report back for SoundStage.
Well, one of the interesting things is, and you kind of touched on this, is that, and the great thing about Munich to me is that you can compare like kind products, right? If you want to listen to large multi-way dynamic loudspeakers, you can go back to back to back in 4 or 5 different rooms and experience the best the world has to offer in that product genre. But then you can also just have a huge diversity of gear. You can go listen to a dynamic loudspeaker, and then you can go listen to an electrostat, and then you can go listen to a massive horn system that wouldn't fit in anyone's home. And you can hear how those sound presentations vary just so dramatically. Yeah. And then you kind of put yourself in the place of the consumer that would buy each of those, because of the unique sound experience that all of those systems offer. So that's one of the great strengths in Munich. And I just want to add one other thing that I think is going to be super interesting at High End 2022, and that is going to be the launch of a number of active and powered loudspeakers. I think that's going to be a trend that we're going to see, and I'm super excited to listen to some of those. I know that there's some big heavy hitter brands that will be announcing products of that genre at the show. So hearing how far those speakers have come just in the past few years is going to be a very interesting thing, and something that we'll be writing about on SoundStage Global extensively, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, actually, in fact, the SCM 50s that I've got in at the moment, they'll run active or passive, so that I can swap out the amplifier modules in the back of them. And I haven't yet switched them back to passive. So my current resident ATCs, I run passive using my Naim amplification. But these I plugged in and they're running with the ATC onboard amps at the moment in active mode. And I'm struck by the increased resolution and the level of detail that that's revealing. And I know ATC are very keen on active amplification. They regard that as far superior for lots of different technical reasons. And certainly my experience so far is bearing it out, I have to say. So I agree with you, Jeff. Hearing the active systems that are up and coming will be fascinating.
Well, and that's a good teaser for your upcoming review as well. I'm sure we'll hear about the comparison between active and passive with those particular loudspeakers, and I look forward to reading your observations. But, well, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me today, and I really look forward to getting to know you a little bit better in Munich and spending some time at High End 2022, touring the rooms and listening to all this amazing gear that I know is going to be present there. And that's just literally a few weeks away from now. So thank you for joining me, and we'll be seeing you in a few weeks.
I'm looking forward to it, Jeff. Thanks so much.
All right. Bye-bye.